everybody. On behalf of the Liu Institute for Asia and Asian Studies and the Ansari Institute for Global Engagement with Religion, I welcome you to this flash panel, Xinjiang and the Uyghurs, Religion, Oppression, and Geopolitics. We're so glad that you're joining this important discussion. My name is Mahan Mirza, and I'm pleased to moderate this event, especially as the Executive Director of the Ansari Institute and as a faculty fellow for the Liu Institute. As an Islamic studies scholar and as a practicing Muslim, I'm particularly interested in this topic and look forward to learning from the insight of our panelists, whom I will now introduce in order of their appearance. Rachel Harris is a professor of ethnomusicology at SOAS, University of London. Her research centers on China and Central Asia, focusing on the Uyghurs. She has conducted field work in Xinjiang, Kazakhstan, and Kyrgyzstan over a period of 20 years. Her current research focuses on intangible cultural heritage, music and identity formation, soundscapes, and state projects of territorialization. Of interest to this conversation, especially for a general audience, may be a 2019 piece that Professor Harris wrote for The Guardian titled "Bulldozing Mosques, the Latest Tactic in China's War Against Uyghur Culture," in which she contends that the leveling of ancient sites in Xinjiang is part of an attempt to destroy an entire society. Our second panelist is James Millward, Professor of Intersocietal History at the Walsh School of Foreign Service at Georgetown University, where he teaches Chinese, Central Asian, and world history. His specialties include the Qing Empire, the Silk Road, Eurasian lutes and music in history, and historical and contemporary Xinjiang. In addition to his academic work, he is active on social media, where he follows and comments on current issues regarding the Uyghurs and PRC ethnicity policy. In July, Professor Millward published an op-ed in The Guardian titled, "The Uyghurs' Suffering Deserves Targeted Solutions, Not Anti-Chinese Posturing," where he notes, and I quote, "There should be no doubt that the policies inflicted by the Chinese Communist Party on the indigenous Central Asians it rules meets the UN definition of genocide," end quote. Our third panelist is Perrin Gurel, Associate Professor of American Studies with a concurrent position in Gender Studies here at Notre Dame. Her research and teaching explore the United States in the world and the world in the United States through transnational feminist lenses, with a special focus on US Middle East relations and Islam in the United States after World War I. Much of Professor Gurel's work has focused on Turkey and adjoining regions, and this expertise lends itself to this conversation as the Uyghurs share cultural, religious, and linguistic similarities with Turkic ethnic groups in the broader Central and West Asian region. So welcome to our panelists and to our online audience. The format of this panel will give 10 minutes to each panelist and then move to audience questions. Throughout this conversation, we invite you to submit questions through the Q&A function on your screen. In order to respect everybody's busy schedules, this panel will conclude promptly at 5 p.m. With that, I invite Professor Rachel Harris to begin our discussion.
Great, thank you very much for your kind introduction, Mahan, and thank you very much for having me on this panel. So I'll dive straight in. I've been traveling to this region, the Xinjiang Uyghur Autonomous Region, for over 20 years now. It's always been a very tightly controlled place. It's the kind of place where I've always felt afraid of the police and afraid of bureaucracy. But over the past few years, that situation has obviously got much more extreme. And this region then has been transformed into a high security police state. We have credible estimates suggesting that over 1.5 million of its Turkic Muslim citizens, primarily the Uyghurs, have been incarcerated and subjected to abusive regimes of indoctrination. We have detailed studies of high-tech surveillance systems and multiple very harrowing testimonies from camp survivors. So China then explains its actions as a necessary response to extremist terror. Uyghur activists in the West, on the other hand, and international observers suggest that its policies amount to genocide, which is something that I would certainly support. But this issue recently then has become a huge political football, deeply implicated in the US election politics around wider problems of engagement with China. My view is that this is too serious an issue to leave to Trump. We need to keep raising awareness and putting pressure on international organizations to respond to this issue. And we've seen enough alarming reports on the drastic birth control policies and the uprooting of communities to see clearly that this is a deliberate policy of erasing Uyghur culture and identity. And these are human rights abuses on a massive scale. We know also that graduates of the camps are being moved into positions of forced labor. And we know quite a lot now about the global supply chains that link their labor to your disposable high street fashion. But I'm not here to talk about that today, although I do urge you to educate yourselves further if you have the time. What I want to talk to briefly today is the question of culture and cultural heritage. I want to give you a few details of the destruction of built heritage that's been going on, historic buildings and holy shrines, and thousands of mosques. I also want to talk briefly about the way that what I call hollowed out forms of Uyghur culture are presented to the outside world as tourist sites or as song and dance spectacles, and how the Chinese government uses these cultural displays to support its message that everything's fine in Xinjiang. The Chinese Communist Party is safeguarding Uyghur culture, and it's also keeping the region from the terrorists. So let me give you just one example of why I think this makes a mockery of the idea of safeguarding culture, and why I really think that UNESCO should be getting involved with these issues. I have an image which perhaps we could share with on the screen now of pilgrims going to a festival called the Ordam Festival. Now this image was taken by my Uyghur colleague, a lady called Rahila Dawut, who is also currently one of those 1.5 million people incarcerated in an internment camp. And she was a researcher of folklore and spent a lot of time documenting these kind of festivals. So this particular festival, the Ordam, it takes place at a holy shrine which lies deep in the desert. It's the burial place of a king called Ali Arslan Khan. He was one of the early rulers who brought Islam to the region in the 10th century. And Uyghurs would make long journeys there. They would go to pray to the saint, to listen to stories about his heroic exploits. And every year the shrine would hold a huge festival. And this festival, which would attract thousands of people, tens of thousands even, would include, of course, prayer, circumambulating the tomb. Sufi groups would come and recite a zikr. They would sing devotional songs. Musicians would sing historical sung stories. And then also you would get food stalls, jugglers, sword swallowers, fairground rides. It was the most extraordinarily vibrant thing. And you can see actually some videos of festivals like these, videos which were made by my colleague Rahila Dawut on the website of a textbook called Music of Central Asia. So that's easy to Google if you want to have a look at that kind of life. The culmination of the festival would be a big procession towards the tomb, and people would march towards the tomb holding big tall flags, and they would plant them in the sand around the tomb. And the procession would be led by musicians playing frame drums and sunai, a kind of very loud oboe kind of instrument. So I keep saying they would, because this hasn't happened now for a good few years. Over a decade ago now, this festival was labelled by the government as a religious extremist gathering, and it was closed down. And more recently, the local authorities transported a bunch of bulldozers across the sand dunes to completely destroy the shrine. And it's interesting to reflect on why exactly they would do that, why they would go to the trouble of bringing these bulldozers deep into the desert to knock over this brick building. And really, the only answer I can think of is that they want to cut off Uyghurs from their culture and erase all traces of their history from the landscape. So if you arrive in Kashgar today, perhaps as part of an organized tour group, and it's very easy to do that, you might even see some of those musicians I mentioned still playing their oboes and their drums, perhaps outside your hotel. Now, probably they'd be paid by a tourist company. They might even be playing the same melody on those same instruments, but the context and the meanings, of course, will be very different. Probably they'd be accompanying a group of attractive young women performing a welcoming dance for the tourists. So this is not what I would call safeguarding Uyghur culture. This, I think, is presenting a shell to the outside world. And it's a shell that masks the very brutal reality of surveillance and incarceration and destruction that lies underneath. And I think that this is something that international organizations like UNESCO, who actively collaborate with China's safeguarding heritage initiatives, I think really this is something they should not ignore. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Harris. Over to Professor James Milward.
Yeah, I'm unmuted, I think.
Yes, you're good to go.
Okay, great. Thank you very much, and thank you very much, Rachel, for that moving introduction to our panel, or to what we're going to be talking about today. So just to quickly, tick off some of the elements that we talk about when we talk about the crisis in Xinjiang, or the extent of the atrocities going on there. Of course, we have the surveillance regime that's all encompassing, powered by artificial intelligence and participated in by many tech companies, Chinese and international. We have the mass arrests, as well as the internments in the camps, both in prisons and in the camps, which started since 2017 in the name of so-called educational transformation. We have a ramping up of a birth suppression campaign, mainly done by strictly enforcing rules which have not been enforced elsewhere in China to this extent recently, and punishing what has not been punished elsewhere, out of quota births, and also massive use of sterilization and IUD placements. Again, much more than is done for Han and other peoples in other parts of China. We have a regime of forced and non-voluntary labor, where Uyghurs and other Xinjiang people are pushed into work in factories and industrial parks in Xinjiang, but also in other parts of China, in Eastern Chinese factories as well. And workers are not free to refuse these postings, and they're not free to move around often once they're sent to these factories, other than just around their dormitories, if that. We have family separation that's interfering with cultural transmission and linguistic transmission. Family separations happening as a result of all of those above factors, and indeed a network of orphanages and boarding schools being built up for very young children where they're raised only in the Chinese language medium. And as Professor Harris just mentioned, this broad attack on Uyghur culture and cultural heritage, architecture, language, the old city of Kashgar, mosques and shrines, restrictions on Sufist practice, music and performance, but also on publishing, the internment of scholars, musicians, artists, writers, editors, all of which really puts the lie to the argument that these policies are aimed at combating extremism, because most of these people, well, they're certainly not extremists, and many of them are in fact party members themselves. And so this broad kind of cultural, really cultural genocide is a term that is appropriate here, or has just occurred to me just now from Rachel's discussion of touristification. We might say that Turkestan is being turned into Touriststan rather than having its culture actually being protected here. So this is a crisis, obviously, and it's beginning to garner the world's attention. I think it's fair to say that it is very much a disjuncture from the past in its scale and its intensity and in its degree of cruelty. But it is also related to past policies by the CCP in Xinjiang. It's not an inevitable culmination of them. It's not an inevitable result of some clash of civilizations or something like that. But it has arisen out of past policies and approaches by the CCP, by the Chinese Communist Party in Xinjiang. Kind of like a cancerous growth can grow out of cells. I don't want to inject too many medical metaphors here because that's something the CCP has done itself. But I think it's a way of thinking about it. It's not inevitably something that would have happened, but it has come out of the past. And I'd like to suggest that when we talk about this past and the CCP problem that it has in Xinjiang, or I'd like to announce or admit or that I've started to use the word colonialism. I guess I'm suggesting it as well here. Now, to say something is colonial, that this place is a colony, this is not useful as an invective. And certainly right now, the Trump administration in the United States has been issuing irresponsible provocations and accusations against the People's Republic of China almost weekly. And it's transparently part of Trump's reelection campaign in a way to evade responsibility for the horrible, messed up response to the coronavirus in the United States. So we have to distinguish that. And so I'm hesitant to add more invectives into the list here. So I don't mean to use colonialism as an invective here, but simply as a kind of frank admission of reality in the sense of, if it walks like a duck and talks like a duck and quacks like a duck, it's a duck. And so it's just worth recognizing. In 1949, when the Chinese Communist Party took over the region of Xinjiang, there were very few Han there, except for a lot of Han soldiers left over from the Kuomintang. The main institution which the Chinese Communist Party has used, particularly in those first years, to populate Xinjiang is the Xinjiang Production Construction Corps, or the Bingtuan. It's a military institution, and its initial rationale, they talked about having one hand on the pickaxe and one hand on the gun. It was to populate the region with Han Chinese. That was one of its goals, and indeed it did that through subsequent decades in many ways. So the problem that was faced by the CCP there too was of a different population, often who were not necessarily happy by control by outsiders, and who sought more say in their own affairs from the very beginning, when the Turkic leadership of the Eastern Turkestan Republic in northern Xinjiang, which was under Soviet influence, but it was very much an ethno-national state. From the very beginning, they had wanted and had hoped and had in some ways been led to expect that there would be a Xinjiang Republic or some kind of autonomous state on the model of the Soviet republics. Of course, that didn't happen. Another reason that it's really quite reasonable to talk about colonialism in Xinjiang is that Chinese governors, in particular in the at the end of the Qing Empire, which preceded the Republican period, and during the Republican period, there was a Confucian governor named Yang Zhengxin, who openly talked about his colonial problem. And he said that China should study France and Britain to learn best practices for this. So it was not really a stigmatized notion then, and he admitted it freely. And Yang Zhengxin was really quite a smart man. He had read about the Qing imperial approach to the region, and in particular understood how the Qing Empire had employed what you could call ethno-pluralism to govern. In other words, putting ethnics in charge of their co-ethnics, peoples in charge of their co-peoples, as a way of providing a measure of autonomy, particularly cultural autonomy. And this allowed Yang Zhengxin to actually maintain control in the region without a lot of, without funds certainly from other parts of China. He was really much cut off from there, without a great military force either. But it allowed him to balance the local interests quite effectively. And this worked well until he was gunned down at a banquet by a Chinese warlord. And we won't go into any more of that history right now. But just sort of to sum up what this governor recognized back in the 1920s was that with a colonial problem like this, the issue is it's very expensive to rule a territory that's distant from the metropole, one that's sparsely populated by people who are different from the majority of the metropole, populated by people who can't pay a lot of tax, and therefore it's hard for them to support, it's hard to support a heavy security structure in such a region, and in particular, non-Chinese people who may or may not be happy under Chinese rule. And so the usual response, if someone like me comes along and starts talking about Xinjiang as a colony, would be, when I say usual, I mean the response from the official Chinese propaganda would be to stress that China is that Xinjiang has been part of China since the Han Dynasty, right? That's something we all hear. I won't go into why that's a problematic statement, but I can simply say, and this is one reason why we should actually think about this as a colonial problem, that just saying Xinjiang is Chinese since the Han Dynasty does not address any of these issues of the colonial problem, right? It doesn't help you with the local population. It doesn't help you with the revenue issues. What you have to do in this kind of situation is two things. Really, there's two main thrusts of policies. One is development. So to reduce the costs of subsidizing control over that region, to extract value, to integrate the economy of the colony with the metropole. This is something which every imperial system will have to do. And then the other thrust of your policies has to be managing diversity. How do you deal with the fact that people are different? What are your ethnic policies? Broadly speaking, these could be pluralist, and so they recognize the differences, maybe even celebrate them, work with them, or assimilationist, where you try to make them go away and erase them. Now, note that settling a colony with people from the metropole can help in both of these sorts of things by diluting the population to a certain extent. But it increases the costs because generally settlers need to be subsidized, need to be incentivized to go, and that's certainly been the case there. All right, so I realize I'm probably already running short on my time. So very, very quickly, let me sort of conclude, and I can go into more detail if people are interested in this, but the problem with development in Xinjiang really over the last few decades, there's been several stages of it. There've been a great program around 2000 called the Great Development of the West. Since around 2010, there was an expansion of what's known as the Pairing Assistance Program. But all of those in one way or another have made the same kind of mistakes, which frankly, United States-led and World Bank-led development in many places does as well. Too top-down, not enough attention to what local people need, too based on building big projects. And in the case of Xinjiang, transport, petrochemicals, so extraction has been the main thrust. Building cities and building Han enclaves has been one of the main results of this. Not enough attention paid to human development, not enough attention paid to raising incomes and education levels of indigenous people, and particularly the Uyghurs in the southern part. And then with regard to the ethnic policies, the ethnic thrust of the colonial approach to Xinjiang, like the Soviet Union, the PRC had a problem of being a socialist state following a large empire. And to deal with that, the PRC adapted a somewhat similar approach. They didn't go for having multiple republics, but they did have autonomous regions. They identified the different ethnic groups of China, as they put it, or of the former Qing Empire, as 56 Minzu, of whom the Uyghur were one, and the Kazakhs and Kyrgyz and Han Chinese. And for some time, they actually celebrated that difference. Their version of E pluribus unum was a conglomerate rather than amalgam. It wasn't meant to melt people down at first, but to actually see them as different components of a national whole. What's happened in the last few years under Xi Jinping has been a very conscious decision on the part of the some ideologues in the party, supported by some anthropologists and others, to reverse course and to start moving away from the composite model to an amalgam model. And they even talk about melting pot, an idea which has been rejected in the United States. And so we're seeing some of the actual implications of that change in ideology about dealing with diversity in these very heavy-handed and I think ultimately, impossible and self-defeating efforts to melt away, to wipe away the cultural differences between Xinjiang peoples and others in China, and indeed Hong Kong peoples and Tibetan and Mongolian and others in this very diverse place that is China. And I'm conscious of the time. I will stop there.
Thank you. Thank you, Professor James Millward. Turning now to our third panelist, Professor Perrin Gurel.
Hi. So thank you for having me. I'm going to focus on the international response to the oppression of the Uyghurs in China, but I'm going to start a bit off field and I hope you'll stay with me. So you may have heard that on August 31st, a chartered flight flew from Israel to the United Arab Emirates for the first time, carrying a team of Israeli and American diplomats, including President Trump's son-in-law, Jared Kushner. In response to this move towards the normalization of relations with Israel, Iran's top authority, Supreme Leader Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, declared that the Emiratis had committed, quote, treachery against the Muslim world, unquote. In a series of tweets, the US Secretary of State, Mike Pompeo, decried Khamenei's reading of the event and added, quote, I'm quoting his tweet, "And if you're looking for those betraying Islam, Khamenei, China is seeking to destroy the Uyghurs. Looking forward to your public call out for the CCP's horrific treatment of those Muslims," unquote. This rhetorical move, familiar from the Cold War era, is generally referred to as whataboutism. When called to account for a condemned policy, a state spokesperson brings up abuses associated with the accusing state and its allies. So whataboutism is not new or surprising, but what I find of interest here is what states are considered accountable for what other states' crimes. Specifically, who has been expected to condemn the oppression of Uyghurs in China and why? Since the events in Xinjiang became common knowledge, various political entities have had the spotlight on them to condemn and to act. First, of course, were the largest and most powerful entities in the world, the United States and the European Union. Our colleague Jim Millward has written an excellent column about the US response in The Guardian, so I'll refer you to that when we can talk more about it in the Q&A. And the Human Rights Watch has described the public European Union response as continuing to just, quote, tick the box marked raise concerns, unquote. So muted and just making sure that you voiced concerns and not necessarily doing something about it. The states that gained attention afterwards, however, were telling. Specifically, Saudi Arabia, Iran, and Turkey have been called to task in the international arena for not responding to the events forcefully enough. I think it's safe to say that within each state, the population's sympathies did lie with the Uyghurs. Out of these three, however, Turkey has been the only one to eventually speak out. These different responses tell us a great deal about the implications of human rights in politics and the constructed nature of state identities. They also help us gauge the state of democracy in each country and deconstruct the idea of the Muslim world. In his book, The Idea of the Muslim World, Jamil Aydin argues that while the Muslim world, a political entity unified by religious identity, does not really exist in any real sense, the political mobilization of the idea has proven powerful in specific instances. Historically, various communities have been identified as the putative center of the so-called Muslim world. For example, President Obama gave his famous address to the Muslim world in Cairo, Egypt, home to the historical Al-Azhar University. Recently, however, many scholars in political science have argued that Iran, Saudi Arabia, and Turkey have been locked in a struggle for the symbolic and cultural leadership of this imagined community. While backing China's Xinjiang policy, Saudi UN Ambassador Abdallah al-Mualimi has claimed, quote, nobody can be more concerned about the status of Muslims anywhere in the world than Saudi Arabia, unquote. So this is one claiming of like, we are the people who speak for the Muslims and we care about them most. Iran's response has been similarly muted, despite its own claims to the moral leadership over Muslims everywhere. The business and trade ties and the US withdrawal from the nuclear agreement, which have made that country even more dependent on China and Russia, largely explain this response. It is also safe to say that the Iranian regime and probably the Saudi Arabian regime broadly share China's stance regarding rights talk, constructing international human rights pressure as unwelcome meddling in their internal affairs and as violation of their national sovereignty. The Turkish case, on the other hand, has perhaps been the most interesting, according to me. Turkey, too, is dependent on Chinese fines and Chinese disavowal and rights-based interventionist rhetoric. In 2018, when Turkish economy was suffering from US-imposed sanctions, China gave the country a $3.6 billion loan. Similarly, China has been quiet on civil rights abuses associated with Turkey's crackdown on dissidents after the failed coup attempt of 2016. Turkey, however, also has very close cultural and linguistic ties with Uyghurs, as Professor Mirza commented on. In fact, it is Ankara's, the capital's official stance, that the Uyghur people are the Turks' close relatives. It's a clunky thing to say because they're also Turkish, but you get it. When I say Turk, I mean Turkish people in Turkey. It's a mess. But it is our official stance. Turkey's official stance is that Uyghur people are close relatives of the Turks. Every primary school child learns to recognize the Uyghurs as relatives from their history book. In fact, our history books start with Central Asia and very often with Uyghurs. And children learn to recognize the Uyghurs as relatives who contributed greatly to Turkish/Turkic history and culture. Our languages are mutually intelligible, and the modern Turkish word for civilized, Uyghur, is said to come from Uyghur, as the Uyghurs were the first Turkic political entity to switch to non-nomadic life, according to what Turks say. I don't know if it's true. In addition, the world's largest community of Uyghur exiles, about 12 million strong, resides in Istanbul and is quite active in their restart efforts. So it's no surprise that the events in Xinjiang drew the attention of both devout and non-devout Turks early on. However, Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdogan, whose words, we're told, carry some weight with Muslims across the world, had not spoken about the oppression of the Uyghurs and other Muslim minorities in China until early 2019, when local politics forced his hand. The reports of the death of renowned Uyghur poet Abdurrahim Hayat in detention appeared to have been the straw that broke the camel's back. Although Hayat was later proven to be alive, on February 9, the Turkish government issued a stern statement denouncing China for, quote, violating the fundamental human rights of Uyghur Turks and other Muslim communities in the Xinjiang Uyghur Autonomous Region, unquote. This made Turkey a significant exception among Muslim majority countries and appeared to point out the role religious and ethnic ties can play in complicating realpolitik. However, even in this case, politics played a much larger role than popularly acknowledged, specifically local politics. Given the sympathies of the population, rival parties had begun exploiting the Erdogan government's silence, organizing massive protests, and attempting to launch parliamentary investigations into China's treatment of the Uyghurs. However authoritarian, Erdogan and his party AKP are dependent on votes and could only prioritize foreign policy and trade ties over electoral politics for so long. So all in all, I think it behoves us to examine which states are being called to condemn the actions of which states and why and by whom. Instead of assuming a normative Muslim unity, it is helpful to see the mobilizations and limits of this concept. In fact, despite the strongly worded public statement, there have been many reports of the Turkish government collaborating with China in arresting, detaining, and deporting Uyghur activists. In specific danger, it seems, are activists who advocate for the independence of what they're calling East Turkestan and any exile with even the most tenuous connection to Syria. In response to the deportation of one family member, one Uyghur exile from Turkey said, quote, "It is so difficult for me to accept that Turkey did this. Turkey, the land that is like our home, where the people are like our own," unquote. Ultimately, however, the failure to condemn human rights abuse despite cultural, linguistic, ethnic, and religious ties is not unusual. As Aidan's book and the Syrian conflict confirm, Muslim disunity is the true reality of our current world. What I find unusual is condemning, despite political and economic pressures operating in the opposite direction. Even in the case of Turkey, a country that has literally built its own identity on Uyghur history and culture, politics drive recognition, even more than vice versa. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you to three very interesting and diverse presentations on this topic. Professor Rachel Harris informs us of the terrible loss of culture, language, and architecture. Professor James Millward invites us to view the Uyghur situation historically and through a colonial lens. And Professor Perrin Gurel sheds light on international responses, focusing on the Muslim world more in quotes, and perhaps Turkey in particular. So we're going to turn to some questions. We received questions in advance, and we've also been receiving some very interesting questions in the Q&A box that Zoom provides. So we ask you to keep those questions coming, and I'll read them in the order in which they appear, unless they've obviously been answered, and then we'll move on. The first question is directed to Professor Harris. How does Professor Harris explain the 2009 Xinjiang riots, which left 156 Han people dead? Don't you think that tighter police control is related to violent riots?
Yes, well, thank you very much for that question. I do very often find questions like these which seem to suggest that, you know, which seek, I think, to undermine some of the facts which we know about the situation in this region. So basically, I would say instances of violence in the region do not excuse this kind of mass cultural erasure. And that is the simple response. But more specifically, in response to the question about the 2009 riots, you know, I mean, I was actually there at the time. I was in Urumqi in the middle of those riots. And so I have quite a close-up experience of what was happening at that time. And I'd actually arrived in Urumqi, in the city where these riots and some very serious inter-ethnic violence took place. And in the days leading up to the violence, you know, we were talking to local people, to Uyghurs on the streets, and there was a very strong sense from people there of anger because of a violent incident which had happened in the south of China a few days before, when some Uyghurs working in factories in the south of China had been attacked by a group of Han Chinese. And this event had not been properly addressed by the authorities. It had been covered up. And so the anger at this failure of the authorities to respond to the original violence led people to demonstrate on the streets. It was a peaceful demonstration in the afternoon. People marched to the square and they called for, you know, for things within the framework of the People's Republic of China. They wanted their own government to be more responsive. And they were met by police violence. They were met by brutality. And it was, I think, that police action that very clearly led to the violent response, the rioting, the destruction of property, and then to inter-ethnic violence. Now, I also know in the aftermath of that there were huge numbers of Uyghurs who were disappeared, who were arrested, who were charged, and who were killed. So I think it's really not very helpful to talk about this situation according to the government narrative in which Han Chinese were the victims of violent Uyghurs. And I would really very strongly recommend the excellent article by my colleague sitting there, Jim Millward, who wrote very extensively about that incident some years ago.
Thank you. Just as a Oh, go ahead, Jim. Would you like to add something? You need to be unmuted.
Very quickly, yeah. Professor Harris just explained it very, very, very clearly. I feel a little more emotional about it, having gone back to looking at actually some of her own testimony and thinking about the whole thing and writing it this summer. And talking about what happened on July 5th in Urumqi without talking about what happened on June 26th in Guangdong is like talking about some of the Black Lives Movement demonstrations and protests and police reaction to them without talking about the shooting of George Floyd, right? And so to make those, one has to be careful in making those kind of comparisons, but what happened a few days earlier, which everyone knew about in Urumqi, was that a Uyghur man was accused of mistreating a Han woman, falsely so, and this was clearly found out later. And then Uyghurs were killed in what's really similar to a lynching. And then the state tried to cover that up. And then the peaceful protest in Urumqi was fired upon immediately by Chinese authorities. And we have a lot of testimony to this. Now, in 1989, when students occupied Tiananmen Square, ultimately after over a month, shots were fired, but not right away. In other demonstrations, even in Hong Kong, we saw the police brutality in front of our eyes there. Live fire was not used on Hong Kong protesters right away, but live fire was used on Uyghur protests right away in that incident. And a riot came out of that, but you have to put it in these broader contexts.
Thank you. I think this connects to a question that came from Emily Wang, who says, as a non-specialist, just listening to this panel, the PRC's current relationship with Uyghur culture seems to me somewhat to parallel the way it engaged with Tibet and Tibetan Buddhist culture. So I wonder if you think of that parallel with the second part of her question. Yet Americans generally seem to have responded to these two kinds of cultural and religious oppression quite differently, which seems perhaps related to the general and likely inaccurate impressions many Westerners have of Buddhism and Islam. Do any of the panelists see similarities or differences between these two issues?
Well, go, Perrin, go.
You got muted again.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, I don't have a very big response, but thank you for that question, and you really made me think. So one difference is obviously this understanding, just general understanding, as you know, that Buddhists are naturally nonviolent and Muslims are naturally, inevitably violent. But I see another connection in that how propaganda can mix in with what should be a legitimate response. Sometimes I think there is propaganda that gets mixed into both situations, and I think Jim Millward has written about it, sort of the anti-Chinese and like anti-communist grandstanding operates in both, but I think it operates more easier in the sense of Buddhism because Islamophobia is such a prevalent reality in the West as well. And I know Professor Harris has more stuff to say about that.
Yes.
Oh, thank you. That was a great link.
Thank you.
I mean, just about the similarities between the Tibetan situation and the situation of the Uyghur and other Muslims in Xinjiang. I mean, there are many direct links. I do think, coming from the very obvious fact that the architect of the surveillance and control system was Chen Quanguo, who was transferred from Tibet to Xinjiang. So he brought with him the experience of governing, you know, the minorities in Tibet and brought that directly to Xinjiang. But of course, in Xinjiang, it was developed on a far larger scale. You know, I mean, I don't think it's quite relevant in China to talk about this kind of fantasy of the peaceful Tibetan Buddhists versus the violent Muslims. You know, I think the Tibetans are often also figured as kind of violent and dangerous in popular Chinese discourse. So, for example, I mean, in the terrible spate of self-immolations that took place in Tibet in 2008, you know, when people were setting themselves on fire in protest against China's policies in that region. And the government narrative was that this was a form of terrorism, which was, you know, very extraordinary and interesting to think about as well. So the act of suicide, which did not, you know, impact on any other civilians around you, was also labeled as suicide.
I think, you know, this is a quick follow-up. This is, the question seems to be about perception in the United States on the situation. And I'm going to quote from something you said, Professor Harris, in your article. You say, this is the Guardian blog, which we're referring to: "We need to place the persecution of Xinjiang's Muslims in the wider context of global Islamophobia." And I noticed that the link to global Islamophobia goes to a piece in Al Jazeera where that argues that Chinese Islamophobia was made in the West. So I wonder if you could say a little bit more about this.
Yes, I think I made that point really because I've often felt quite uncomfortable about a certain exceptionalism that enters the debate about the Uyghurs. So, you know, it's very easy for a particular constituency to complain about China's, you know, gross human rights abuses and yet be completely silent on Palestine or Myanmar or, you know, many other instances of the oppression of Muslim peoples around the globe. And there are many. So I think it is very important to make those links. Yeah, no, that's it. And then, you know, you can trace many continuities, historical continuities, similarities in tone, and even direct links between the Chinese form of Islamophobia and indeed that which was created in the West. It's very interesting to compare the language. And again, I must recommend the work of another colleague, Sean Roberts, whose book is just out and addresses this topic, I think, very well.
Thank you. You know, following up on the question of global Islamophobia as being one problem, anti-Asian sentiment is another problem. And anti-Asian hate is on the rise, stemming in no small part from rhetoric from the White House, especially amidst this pandemic, where President Trump likes to refer to the coronavirus as the China virus. How does one criticize and challenge Chinese policies on the one hand without falling into a kind of anti-Asian xenophobia on the other? Professor Millward, yes. Jim.
Well, I think it's really not as hard as it may seem. I mean, certainly in political systems such as the United States, you know, it is easy to sort of, you know, go all in China bashing, and this is to a certain extent happened. You know, both sides of the aisle, both Democratic and Republican politicians are you know, concerned about China. I think the way around that, though, is to actually be realistic in your policies. One of the strongest critiques against Trump is that he is not tough on China. His approaches, even his tariffs, have not succeeded in achieving any U.S. security or U.S. economic goals, right? So you know, practical diplomacy rather than these kind of showy stunts are going to, like closing consulates, for example, as he recently did in Houston, you know, are what achieves things. And you know, we used to have a State Department that could operate along those lines and knew this. And this is one of the things that Trump has done in undermining the State Department. So that's one way. But I think for average people, I don't know. No one is average, and we're all average at the same time. Anyway, for non-politicians, let me put it that way. You know, try to think, I'm trying to think on the human plane. I'm not using the term American values or democratic values, and certainly not, you know, Western values or anything like this. Because, you know, most of my Chinese friends and colleagues share all of those values, frankly. You know, maybe not political expressions of them, but same sorts of thing. But, you know, thinking along those lines, you can know that there are many Chinese people who would be appalled if they knew what was going on in Xinjiang. And the problem is really one of information and disinformation, of news bubbles. And we see that in the United States now, you know, actually operating. And you can imagine how in a system with a, you know, authoritarian system with strong media controls, how it can be even more important or even more divisive like that. So what has to look, well, I'm sounding very idealistic here, but I think you have to trust in people and try to communicate with people. And we still can do this, right? And try to get messages through like this and not simply follow the back and forth and tit for tat of political leaders.
Yeah, thank you. I think this leads us into a cluster of questions that I'm seeing on how to hold big tech accountable for their support of the surveillance state and this genocide. And that big tech needs to be accountable for a lot of things that are happening here as well in other parts of the world. So that's one question. A related question from an anonymous attendee is there any way to educate people in China? So what you exactly just spoke of, how do we get this out, the word out there? Is it even possible in the information ecosystem that we have operating in societies today? The person asked, my dad lives in Beijing and completely agrees with what the Chinese government is doing in Xinjiang. We both believe the other side is somehow brainwashed by either the Chinese or Western media. And our conversation didn't seem to reach any agreement. And then the third question here from Charlie Pine is, who's, you know, an expert in China, has lived there for 20 years. Do you see any way of appealing to China's own sense of morality or ethics to encourage them to make changes in the current policies in Xinjiang? You know, what we hear about is always placing pressure from the outside, containing and sanctioning, punishing. But how do we appeal to the native ethics of the people? How do we arouse that sense in them to look towards a different vision of either empire or colonialism that's more pluralistic rather than the one that they've turned to now? So any thoughts on this kind of cluster?
Yes. Well, I can kick off on some of those. I'm tempted to raise the spectre of Mulan at this point and suggest that people don't go and watch that if they want to find a different way of thinking about China's relationship with its Western regions, because Mulan is so full of that whole kind of colonial ethos and mentality. So just give that a break. And you know, the fact that they were thanking, of course, the Turpan Public Security Bureau is really enough to suggest a boycott is in order. But that's my little bit of kind of boycott and activism. I think, you know, the question of creating solidarities is really important. And again, it's an antidote to all that kind of narrative coming from the West of, you know, boycott and put the pressure on the government. So in London, we've spent quite a lot of time giving talks to Chinese students. You know, we have a lot of Chinese students in London, and it's been really very interesting. I've spoken at events organized by universities' faculty for their students. I've also spoken at events which have been organized quite bravely, perhaps, by like Hong Kong Chinese student associations. And it's been extremely interesting to talk to the students there. And I think the more that one can provoke those kind of conversations that one of the questions mentioned, you know, across families, even within families. I think that is really important work to be done.
Mhm. Thank you. Yes, Jim, please go ahead, and then we're going to move to some concluding thoughts. So go ahead.
Okay, I think, so on the, you know, how do we do this? How do you communicate? How do you create, you know, solidarities? So calling the Chinese colonialists is probably not a good way to do it, even though I spent 10 minutes doing that. So I recognize that, but that's why I was trying cautious about that. You know, on the issue of Mulan, I just recently got asked, I have written something which will come out in a week or so, I hope, but I was asked to write something else again by an editor, and they wanted me essentially to reiterate the criticisms that we've all heard, in particular to talk about the Xinjiang connection, obviously, because I know something about Xinjiang. And I sort of had this idea, like, what else is there that hasn't been done already, you know, besides just piling on there? And one idea I had was, what it would be great for us to get a Chinese person of letters, you know, a writer or someone, to review the movie, to talk about the movie. Forget about these political controversies necessarily, but why is the movie just so bad? Why is it has no, you know, Chinese people don't like it, right? And the comparison, which I heard one person on Chinese social media say, was it was like eating General Tso's chicken, right? It's like the American version of Chinese, or eating in a weird, you know, American Chinese food. You know, why is that? Why is Disney, despite spending $200 million and literally, you know, kowtowing in order to please China with this movie, why do they get it so wrong? Reaching out and asking for that kind of conversation, you know, even if it is in the shadow of the more controversial political issues, is really important, because you know, for Americans to understand why Mulan does not represent Han Chinese culture would be an important thing, right? Or does not adequately represent that. So maintaining those ties, and that's why I think academic connections, I strongly oppose the Trump administration's onslaught against academic connections with China and calling, you know, all students spies and that kind of thing. That's precisely the wrong thing to do. We need to open up as many connections, keep them open as best we can.
Thank you. Well, there's more questions on the table that we're not going to be able to get to. It's always good when there are more questions than there are answers. So we're going to keep learning, but we also have to do things. And in these last kind of 3 minutes that we have, I wonder if each of you would share your summation of what it is that students here can do, or the public that's watching can do, to help the Uyghur situation, which, as we see, is connected to so many other global issues that perhaps we have to engage as a common front in order to move things to a better place. So in any order, who would like to go first for concluding thoughts? Perrin?
I'm unmuted, right?
Yes.
I'll go first because I'm going to be kind of pessimistic, and then hopefully our other panelists can pull things together. But even the questions are reminding me that we live in this era of sort of news bubbles and fake news and the question of truth and reality. And honestly, in researching this, I felt that slide of reality under me, kind of looking at the different statements and everything. So I think it's going to be very difficult. How, you know, a lot of the questions are saying, what can young Chinese generation do? How do we reach out? And I don't have an answer to that, but I think maybe one step is being aware of the warping of reality everywhere, including in the United States and including in places that we might think reality thrives, like places of higher education. So I will start with that very depressing note. And my other depressing note is related to this question that wasn't addressed about what Malaysia, why haven't Malaysia and Indonesia and Pakistan, right? The Asian sort of Muslim majority countries, why haven't they said anything? Because they have economic ties, right, with China. And that's the main answer. And even the ones that are more more pliable to public pressure, that are more democratic, can be taken in by this terrorism narrative. And that can be used to justify not speaking out or speaking out in like just checking the box sort of way. So let me start very depressingly that I think we need to stay critically aware of these realities and kind of ground ourselves in the sources as much as we can.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for that, Perrin. I mean, I must say I'm not particularly optimistic myself. You know, every time I get an update on what's going on in the region, you know, I feel very pessimistic again. But still, I think that's not a reason to stop speaking out, right, and to stop educating. And there are always ways to put on pressure, and all pressure has to be good. So, you know, if you want to find particular campaigns to join, there are many out there on Twitter. There are very excellent small organizations working really hard to document the individual histories of the detainees, organizations like the Xinjiang Victims Database, which desperately need funding. So, you know, it's very easy to find ways to do a little bit to help.
I'll just add that, is it the Xinjiang Cultural Institute in Paris, Rachel? Is that the proper name? There's another, Xinjiang Cultural Institute is another good organization to donate to. But I'm a little more optimistic by recent developments. I cautiously approve of the targeted sanctions, such as global Magnitsky sanctions and entity listing, which the US government has been doing recently, particularly when they alert companies to the dangers of getting involved with and getting caught up in Xinjiang supply chains. A lot of fashion companies are definitely got the wind up because of this, not because they're necessarily consciously or even knowledgeably involved. Some have been, but because they realize now that it's so easy indirectly to be involved with the Xinjiang forced labor regime through your suppliers or your suppliers' suppliers. And the Disney events right now, the 14-year-old daughter of a friend of ours stopped their family, said, no, we can't watch Mulan because of the Uyghurs, okay? So this has gotten down to very young people, and they're taking principled stands from what they've heard about this issue. And so this kind of thing will percolate upwards. It's not simply the bloviating from Pompeo and Trump and that kind of thing. Much more powerful is people like, or Feroza Aziz, the young woman with the eyelash curling. I won't try and do that myself, but she reached millions of people, and Mulan, and so younger people with their consumption choice, with their communication with corporations, it goes on up, and the corporations communicate with suppliers, and suppliers have ways in China in the system of communicating with authorities. And so this is definitely having an impact, and we need to keep it up and expand that. Not so much because we need to punish Disney per se, although some might say we do, but because the effects of slaughtering this particular monkey really, sorry, it's a Chinese expression, kill the monkey to scare the chickens. So a lot of chickens are going to get scared by killing this particular monkey.
Thank you. I'd also just like to draw your attention to the chat box, where Professor Jim Millward has posted a link to a paper just released today from the Brookings Institute. He co-authored it, and it has a long list of recommendations for the US, other countries, and also China on what to do. So if you want to get into more details, that's one place where you can look. And with that, we are at the end of our time for today. I'd like to thank all the panelists once again. We appreciate your expertise and engaged scholarship. Thank you also to all of our audience members online for joining us today. Please learn more about future events at asia.nd.edu and ansari.nd.edu. We hope to see you again soon. Thank you.